I went to visit my girlfriend and her family in Lawrence during the holidays. Her dad enjoys exploring, and her parents are night owls. One night, we all decided to go to Stall Cemetery, which was about 20 minutes away from her house. It was around 4, and my girlfriend's mother chose to stay home, so her father, she and I went. When we arrived, we parked near a church across from the cemetery. I was feeling a bit scared because her dad had told us that the town doesn't let outside people into the cemetery, and usually there's a police officer there to stop people from going in. But this time, there wasn't any. When we got out of the car, it was so quiet, almost like the air was heavy and stopping the wind. We left the car and crossed the street. As we walked past the graves, we noticed a dead tree standing alone at a turn that led us up a hill. At the hill's peak, there were only ruins left of a church that used to be there. My girlfriend told me that the town destroyed the church in the 90s because lots of people would come and damage it, especially on Halloween. According to a local story, if you threw a glass bottle at the back wall of the church and it didn't break then, Satan would come and take you to hell. The remains of it were still there. We walked around and even moved things around to see if we could find anything interesting. Unfortunately, we found nothing except for some strange scratches on some of the stones. It didn't seem like it was done by an animal, but it could have been kids playing around. We searched for another 20 to 30 minutes, then headed behind the church toward the dead-looking trees. We walked around some bushes along the edge. Since it was so quiet, we could hear a car coming from a couple of miles away, so we turned off our flashlights to make sure nobody could see us. Then, my girlfriend found a glass bottle near the edge of the church just lying on the grass. It was an empty glass bottle. When she saw that I was about to bend over and pick it up, she later told me she couldn't believe I would touch it. Her dad was on my side, shining a flashlight on the bottle. As soon as I touched it, we heard a strange sound. It sounded like gas or fizzing, even though the bottle was empty. The sound seemed to be coming from about 15 feet away toward the back of the rubble. Right away, her dad and I shone our flashlights toward the noise, but we didn't see anything. About 3 seconds after the fizzing, we heard a strange gargling sound and some sort of clicking. It sounded like an animal, but not one I recognized. Her father, who had lived in Kansas all his life, said he'd never heard a sound like that before. What was odd was that if it was an animal, it should have been scared or woken up earlier because we had been making noise and walking around for a while. We never found where the sound was coming from. I finally dropped the bottle and took a couple of photos. When I looked at those pictures, I saw something kind of weird a face in one of them in the background. Feeling quite scared, we walked back to the car. When we reached it, we noticed the lights were on inside. It was the only light in the darkness. As we approached it from a distance, we checked all the doors and they were all locked and closed. I thought maybe one of us had left the door open, so I got into the car and turned off the light. None of us remembered turning them on when we left. In fact, we remembered turning them off because my girlfriend's dad was changing the batteries in one of the flashlights. Even before we got to Stall.it, all took place when I was just 13 on a Halloween night that I'll never forget. At the time, I lived in a brand new suburb freshly built to accommodate the growing town next to the freeway. Things have changed a lot since then, but it's funny how you could notice it most at the cemetery, which was a bit off the main road and used to be on the edge of town. Not many people had passed away yet, so it was mostly empty, but that night me and my 2 friends, let's call them Aaron and Michael, decided we'd rather explore the quiet graveyard than go trick-or-treating. We dressed up in costumes and first grabbed some candy bowls from houses, mixing them all up to make it seem like we'd gone trick-or-treating just like our parents expected. Then we walked about a mile away from the usual path to get there. We had to climb over a fence around a big pond, which was used for draining water from the freeway. Then, we walked along the edge of the pond and climbed another fence to get into the cemetery. It was really dark, so we figured nobody would see us, but we didn't realize someone was following us. The place was super empty and kind of creepy. We were used to seeing graveyards filled with tombstones, but this one was mostly just empty grass. We got bored after a while, but we didn't want to go home yet, so we sat against some gravestones, making sure not to sit on any graves. We were just sitting there, acting like regular kids for a moment, when suddenly we heard what seemed like someone behind us. We all got scared, turned around, but there was nothing there, just gravestones. The wailing kept going, and then it started saying our names. We thought we were the only ones there, so maybe it was a ghost who was angry at us for trespassing. We cautiously approached the sound, taking tiny, scared steps, hoping to find someone hiding behind a gravestone playing a prank on us. Each of us held onto pieces of broken granite, as if it could protect us from the ghostly presence. It felt like we were pinpointing where the sound was coming from. Then, it said something that haunts me every day. Just to give you some background, my friend Aaron's grandmother was really sick. That's one of the reasons we were acting out by sneaking into the cemetery in the first place. Aaron was feeling down and angry at everything, but he was still our friend, so we hung out together. But when the voice said it was his grandmother's ghost, Aaron froze. I can't imagine what he was thinking, a jumble of strong feelings for sure. It must have been overwhelming for a 13-year-old. He yelled back, trying to deny it, but it hit him so hard that he couldn't stop his tears. Then everything shifted suddenly, when the voice stopped crying and started laughing. It no longer sounded like a woman's ghost, but more like a sneaky boy laughing. We glanced over and spotted someone creeping out from behind a gravestone. I know who it was, but I can't tell you his name. He was older than us by a few years and was known as a bully in the neighborhood. In a flash, Aaron's sadness turned into rage. He stormed toward the bully, who was laughing so much he didn't see how angry Aaron was. Nobody saw what Aaron did next. He tackled the boy to the ground and started hitting him. Michael and I felt the same way, hating how this kid bullied us, so we didn't stop Aaron. We thought it might teach him a lesson, but we didn't realize until it was too late that Aaron wasn't just hitting the boy with his hand, but with the piece of gravestone he'd grabbed earlier. Michael and I glanced at each other nervously, realizing this had gone too far. We knew we had to stop it, so we rushed over to Aaron and pulled him away from the bully. Aaron calmed down and began to understand what he had done. He pulled away from us, but then panicked and rushed back, trying to wake the kid up by shaking him and yelling his name. Michael called 911 and told them what happened. Within 10 minutes, the police and medics arrived. They checked and told us he was unconscious, but his condition was pretty bad. Then, they took him to the hospital, and fortunately, he survived. The doctor said if Michael hadn't called 911, things could have turned for worse. This happened around the middle or end of the 2000s at Greenwood Cemetery in southwest Decatur, Illinois. This cemetery is considered one of the scariest places in the Midwest. It started as a burial ground, then became a mass grave for soldiers during the Civil War. It was also connected to some cult activities around that time. A big flood washed away many graves a long time ago. My sister Celia has always been interested in creepy things. This caused some issues for her because she was raised by our great-grandparents, who were very kind but also very religious. She moved to Decatur, which was turning into a place filled with crime, much like it is now. It was already pretty chaotic in her new house. There was a creepy basement room with dirt on the floor. The previous owner, an old man, had passed away, and her mom had visited the house before. She mentioned everything looked very dark, like it had been burnt, so there was already a weird vibe in the house. Celia, my sister, was feeling down because of life struggles and money problems. As a kind of escape, She started going on ghost hunts with her friends. I won't bother telling you their names, because being lazy is fun. They often went to Greenwood Cemetery. It was like a safe place for Celia in a weird way. She'd go there at midnight with her dog Brutus, who was still alive and a great dog. They didn't experience anything too scary, just some weird noises now and then. Then, one night, when she went with her friends, things got really wild. The first time they went, they took lots of pictures. Then, one of them went up to a light pole and said, "If there's anyone here with us, knock back." He knocked on the pole, but nothing happened. A little while later, they heard 2 really loud knocks. They turned around to look, but they didn't see anything. But then, suddenly, they all felt like time had stopped. It felt like something made them turn their heads toward a gravel road on the other side of a fence. Just as they turned, they all saw 2 dark shapes running down the road, but these things didn't make any noise, didn't breathe, and seemed like misty clouds, just like in horror movies. Everyone felt frozen, unable to move until the shapes had gone by. Then they hurried out of there, running back to the car for a whole mile later. Celia looked into it and found out that some others had also seen these shapes before, but it was apparently a rare thing. The pictures they took were packed with colorful orbs of all sizes, but they never made copies. After some time, they gathered courage to return and went to the scariest part of the cemetery called Hell's Hollow. They were acting mean and talking about how the place wasn't as scary as they thought. They didn't really believe it, but they wanted to see if they could get a reaction because nothing scary had happened yet. And then, out of nowhere, they heard a really scary scream coming from the sky like a woman being torn apart. They decided to leave again and headed back to their cars. They sat there for a bit and talked when one of Celia's friends had a cat toy laser and was playing with it. While she played with the laser lights, appeared in the trees. Celia noticed they formed a pattern, 2 white lights, followed by a deep red one. They definitely weren't flashlights or made by people. Then the chain-link fence started shaking really hard. They drove away fast, but they felt like something was following them. When they got back home, everything seemed fine until they found there was something strange in the closet and often heard scratching and growling sounds coming from inside. After their experience at Greenwood, Brutus, the dog, always seemed scared in the house. Also, some doors in the basement would open by themselves, especially the one near the dirt room. There were often stomping sounds coming from different rooms, especially when someone was alone. People would hear their names being called while they showered, especially Celia. I think whatever it was, it attached itself to Celia the most because of her dark emotions, and this really fueled the entity. There was one time when she was alone with Brutus at night during a power outage, but then she turned and saw a shapeless dark shadow moving over the furniture and drifting down the hall. She grabbed Brutus and sat on the porch for hours until the others came home. They had rented the house to a guy before, but he left about a week later, probably because he experienced something strange too. Celia often has dreams that seem to predict the future or give her warnings, but she turned her life around and found her faith in Christ again. It seems like this has kept away any darkness that might have still been lingering around her. I remember working night security at a cemetery for about 2 weeks. It wasn't something I wanted to do as a security guard, but I had no choice at the time. I really didn't want to work at the cemetery because it's kind of creepy and gives me the shivers. This cemetery is the oldest one in the city, and it's well known. People come here to remember their loved ones, but recently some graves got robbed, and everyone got scared, so they hired us to keep watch at night to stop this. It only happened 2 times recently within a span of 2 weeks, which made everyone worry it might happen again. I was really nervous on the first night, so I walked around a lot in the cemetery, hoping it would help me get used to how scary it was being there in the dark. But it had the opposite effect. Then one night, I saw one of the graves already robbed by grave robbers. The grave they dug up was already filled back in, but the grass hadn't grown back yet. The marker was old and worn, but I could tell it belonged to an old woman. I said a little prayer and kept walking, not thinking too much about it. For a few nights, nothing exciting happened. It was one of the most boring beginnings to a job I've ever had. Normally I finish work by 4, 0 or 5. 0 I'm at the latest, but here I was in the graveyard from 8:0 p.m. to 8:0 a.m., 3 nights a week. That schedule didn't fit me well, as I got very sleepy halfway through each shift, and the coffee they had tasted like water to me. Instead of struggling to stay awake when I was tired and nothing was going on, I allowed myself to nap whenever I felt like it. Also, I didn't think the grave robbers would dare to come back for a third time once they knew I was there. On my last night there, I was really tired from the earlier shifts, and it didn't take long for me to start falling asleep in my chair. I fell into a really deep sleep and started dreaming. I can't remember how the dream began, but it turned into a scary nightmare. I thought I was lying down for a massage or something, but suddenly I felt a sharp pain in my stomach. I screamed and woke up to see a thin old woman standing over me with a shovel. I suddenly opened my eyes, and then right outside the booth window, I saw that same creepy old woman staring straight at me. I jumped back and lost sight of her for a moment. When I stood up, she was gone. I didn't want to go out there, but it was my job to check for trespassers, even though I didn't really want to. Also, I didn't feel any safer staying in the toll booth like a sitting duck, so I went outside into the cold night under the bright full moon and turned on my flashlight, shining it all around. At first, I didn't see anyone, but then I got scared when I noticed a weird figure standing at the back of the property near the trees. I yelled at them, but they didn't say anything. I had to glance away for a moment because I heard some rustling in the bushes behind me. Luckily, it was just a possum that got scared and ran away. That made sense and calmed me down a bit, but I was still curious about that strange figure by the woods. When I looked back, I couldn't believe how such a frail old woman could move so fast, but I went over to where I last saw her without really thinking. I had to walk all the way across the graveyard to get to the back of the property. Along the way, it felt like every single animal in the woods was acting crazy. I heard lots of birds suddenly flying away from the trees all at once. Then an owl made one of those loud screeches they do. Even some coyotes in the distance were acting strange. It felt like nature itself was telling me not to go on. But deep down, I was afraid that if I stopped walking, something bad might happen. I used my flashlight to look around and called out to the person I saw, but I didn't see or hear anyone. Suddenly, all the noises in the woods stopped, and everything became quiet. Even the bugs stopped making noise. I was confused and started to turn around, but then I realized I was standing right on top of one of the graves that had been robbed. Then, out of nowhere, I felt someone's hands grip my throat tightly, and they kicked my feet out from under me. I couldn't see who it was, but they were really strong. They smashed my face into the freshly filled dirt, probably a dozen times, until I started feeling like I was going to pass out. Suddenly it stopped, and the rough feeling of the hand just vanished. I quickly stood up, feeling panic, but I couldn't see anyone around. It felt like I had imagined the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't. It felt too real. That night, I didn't finish my shift. I ran to my car, feeling scared, and I quit the job right then and there. This event has stayed with me ever since. Over the years, I've figured out what it meant. I think the spirit of the old woman whose grave was robbed didn't like me not doing my job properly, so she took action to make sure it wouldn't happen again. I've never been someone who believes in superstitions, But sometimes life surprises you and makes you rethink what you know.